My name is Andrea Thomas, and I wrote Peace Filled in celebration of my 40th birthday. Birthdays are celebrations of life, and my life has been marked by peace. So thank you for joining me for stories from my life and for the study of God's Word. Let's jump into this journey of finding peace for our everyday, real lives. When I was 6 years old, I sat near the back of the church building where my family attended services and where we served the other members of our church and other people as well. I sat next to my mom when I suddenly felt what I can only describe as the presence of peace surround me. Now, I don't know what the pastor was saying on that Sunday night as he preached from the pulpit, but I felt this presence. The problem was that though this presence was all around me, I wasn't experiencing the peace of this presence internally. I knew this presence, though. I knew he wasn't an impersonal force. I knew this presence was Jesus, and I also knew if I desired for him to come into my life, he would. And in those moments, my life was changed forever because the living presence of God began to dwell within my very being. And his presence meant that where there had been no peace, peace then entered my life forever. Now, you may think with a story like that, I've lived a very peace-filled life. You may think I've never struggled with crippling fear or relational drama because I have the very presence of peace living in me. But that story that I just shared with you, it's my salvation story. It's not the sum of my sanctification. You may be familiar with the words salvation and sanctification, but because they're important in where we're going, let's make sure we're on the same page. When I use the word salvation, I am talking about the moment that God declares a person forgiven of her sins and declares her righteous before him. Before that moment, God is at work. There is a process, so to speak, of him drawing a person to himself. But that moment of salvation is a transformational moment. The transformation happens in an instant, and it's not a process. In that moment of salvation, our identity and position before God are radically transformed. Before that moment, we are slaves to sin with no hope of saving ourselves. Before that moment, we are enemies to God, and we cannot have a whole or an unbroken relationship with him. But in that moment of salvation, we become his dearly loved children, and we are saved from sin's power, sin's penalty, and we receive the promise that one day we will be free from sin's presence. Salvation is a moment of radical transformation. It is a moment where God changes our identities and our positions, no longer an outsider, no longer a slave to another master. Instead, forever, we are dearly loved children and citizens of God's kingdom. Sanctification follows salvation, and it is a lifelong process. It is the process of us living out of our new identities and living the truth of our positions. I'm going to give us an illustration to help us. It's an oversimplification, but I do think it will help. When you're hired for a job, there's a moment where you are hired. You have the job. So it can be said that your position has changed. No longer are you unemployed, or no longer should you see yourself as someone who does your old position. You have a new position in that moment. But then you have to live out the new position, which is often a process. You have to learn how to do the position you've been hired to do in the way that fits with your new boss's expectations of you. In my salvation story, I went from being someone who had no peace with God to being someone who had peace with God so much so that his very presence is with me, dwelling in me forever. And from the moment of my salvation, God has worked in my life to help me to live out my new identity and position. Now, I want to be clear. There was a starting point of peace in my life. It was the moment I experienced salvation. The starting point of peace came by way of a change in my position and identity. Without that change, there's no sanctification, there's no having peace, and there's no living out the peace. But because of my salvation, because of that starting point, there is sanctification. I am now in process, not working to earn a new position and identity, but instead living out of what I've already been given. Why do I want to be clear about the starting point, my salvation, and its connection to sanctification? Well, we need to know position and identity inform practical living. Who we are drives how we live. If we don't have peace with God, then we cannot live a peace-filled life. But if we have peace with God, if we have a whole, unbroken relationship with Him, then we will more and more live peace-filled lives. This week, we're going to explore the starting point more. We're going to look at why salvation is necessary for peace. Now, this may not be a new concept for you, so be encouraged. We're going to also explore how remembering and reviewing the starting point is valuable.